Well, good evening, everyone. If you'd like to follow along with me here tonight, we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. We've been working our way through these speeches that Solomon has been giving on wisdom to his sons, stressing the importance of wisdom, the benefits of it, the consequences of ignoring it. And we're getting close to the end of Solomon's speeches here. This is his 9th of 10 speeches. And in this one, what we notice as we work our way through it is that Solomon is using all of these different words that sort of describe hunting. We see words like snare, caught, hunter, fowler, robber, capture, and thief. And we talked about that theme. And as we read through this chapter, what we see is that Solomon is telling his sons of 4 things, 4 hunters that can rob you of a peaceful, good life. And so he's warning his sons about these things. And what we first noticed in verses 1 to 5 was the first hunter. And however you want to word that, financial bondage or being in debt, something like that. That's the first hunter, is being in debt. And he kind of walked through the problem with that, how you get stuck in that. And what we saw is that you can get snared by this by still being a good person. You can fall into debt while still having good intentions. It's not like, debt is a consequence of someone who lives a poor life or someone who doesn't care about God's word and goes their own way and they have this rebellious attitude and they're wicked and sinful. What we see is that well-meaning people who want to do good can also fall into debt. And so we have to be cautious about it. And Solomon gives a few examples of how that can happen. It can happen from helping a neighbor, kind of over-promising or helping them in a poor way, and you can tie your own financial future to theirs, right? And so that can get you into problems. It might be something informal like a handshake, or you might be caught by your own words by not thinking ahead. And so he just lists off some of these different ways that you can get stuck in that. And then ultimately, he explained that we want to get out of debt quickly. We want to do everything that we can, even if it costs us sleep, to get out of that situation. That's the best way to get out of that. And so that's what we reviewed at the end of last week. And so this week, we're going to pick up in verse 6 and see if we can identify who the next hunter is that Solomon is talking about. What is the next hunter that can rob a young man of a good, peaceful life? Okay? So let's read verses 6 to 11 in Proverbs chapter 6 and see what that might be. Starting in verse 6, it says, "Go to the ant, you lazy one. Observe its ways and be wise, which, having no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares its food in the summer and gathers its provision in the harvest. How long will you lie down, you lazy one? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, then your poverty will come in like a drifter, and your need like an armed man." Okay, so having read that, what is this second hunter? What can rob you of a good, peaceful life here? Matt? Laziness, right? Laziness is something that can rob you of a good, peaceful life. Now, an interesting thing about Solomon here, you notice that in verse 6, he almost starts with a fable, right? We would compare that perhaps to Aesop's fables. Well, Solomon, we're told, had much knowledge of the natural world, and he drew lessons from that. So if you turn over briefly to 1 Kings chapter 4 in verse 33. Speaking of Solomon, it says, he told of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He told also of animals, birds, crawling things, and fish. And this is in a broader section that's describing Solomon's wisdom and all of these different songs that he wrote, and parables and proverbs. And so in this collected wisdom of Solomon, we see that he was also a little bit of a naturalist, and he drew lessons from observing the world that God made. And that's what we see him doing here. He's drawing a lesson from nature. Okay? So, going to Solomon's example of the ant back in Proverbs chapter 6, what can we learn in regards to laziness? What can we learn from the ant?
The ant prepares. It works hard to prepare for weather.
Right.
I mean, if you go out loud like nature or something, which have included the ants. Ants are very ambitious.
Yeah. They work hard, right? They prepare.
Hard.
Yeah.
And they work together.
And they work together. Yeah. Matt?
It almost seems like there's maybe a built-in insult, like, can't you be more productive than this little ant that we don't think much of, you know?
Right.
You're a big guy and you're lazy.
Right. This humble little creature is able to understand this, right? To understand this wisdom. Yeah. So those are great points, right? An ant works. It keeps a schedule despite having no boss to enforce it, right? You notice there in verse 7, it says, speaking of the ant, it says, which having no chief, officer, or ruler, right? But you might say, well, doesn't an ant have, a queen ant or something like that? Aren't they like bees or whatever, and don't they follow that rule?
I think in general they do, but they have they have certain. It's kind of like the bees again. They have certain little workers and little guys who do this and guys who do that.
Yeah.
So they have their set assignment on.
Right. We might label one ant like a queen ant or other ants worker ants, but it's not the same as having a boss. Right. It's more about the role that they fulfill within their little ant community, rather than having a boss that says, all right, today's your shift. You work the morning, you work the night. It's not quite like that. So that's his point. The ant, it doesn't have a boss, and yet it's working because this is in its own best interest, right? This is for its own good.
Yeah, like you said, it's for the good of the community too. Really.
Right.
So, because when we work and produce and do things in our lives, it does help the community sometimes in ways we don't see it.
Right. Absolutely. So it's helping its community as well, not just itself, but its community. Matt?
And while I'm sure God understood all of the complex natures of ants and bees, I think the regular people wouldn't have understood that sort of
Sure.
thing. That people just saw ants and were, oh, ants doing this.
Right.
Just kind of speaking where they are.
Right. I don't think technicalities of language in this case, undermine the wisdom that Solomon's pointing out here, right? There's a good lesson to be learned that this small bug is able to prepare for itself, prepare for members of its community in ways that humans sometimes miss, right? So it prepares food in advance. And so obviously a practical lesson here is, saving for your future so that you won't be hungry, right? Especially in those times, saving ahead, saving of the food perhaps that you grew or from your wages. And that's a lesson that even applies today, right? When you get your paycheck, you want to set aside some for your food. You don't want to go and spend it all on everything else and leave yourself with nothing to eat, right? So he's pointing this out, and he then goes and kind of, after talking about the ant for a minute, he then addresses the person he's talking to. He says, how long will you lie down, you lazy one? Right? It's almost worded as a rebuke. Even the ant can do this. So how long are you going to be lazy? Right? Kind of to Matt's point. How long are you going to be lazy? He says, when will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, right? Indicating that, someone's saying, well, I'll just maybe I just won't work today, or I'm tired. I don't want to do it today. I'm not going to get this done. I'll put it off tomorrow, right? And so that puts them in poverty in the end, right? However, I want you to consider a few verses here. Turn with me over to Psalms for just a minute. Back into Psalms. You thought we were out of it, but we're not. Psalms 127, verse 2. Psalms 127, verse 2. It says, "It is futile for you to rise up early, to stay up late, to eat the bread of painful labor. This is how he gives to his beloved sleep." Or perhaps if you read in one of the other versions, you can see in King James, very similar, it is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. We also see, still in the Old Testament, if we turn over to Exodus chapter 20 in verse 11, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11, we see an account of creation here. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that is in them. He rested on the seventh day. For that reason the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So here in Psalms and in Exodus, we have two verses that are talking about how sleep is a gift. And God actually made rest into a command. That's what the Sabbath was. It was a day of rest, just in the way that God rested from his labors of creation. So how do we put these two, or I guess 3 verses together? How do we reconcile these two things? Solomon's saying that, well, a little rest here, a little sleep there. And he's saying that's a bad thing because it leads to poverty. Whereas here we see God rested, and this was a good thing. And we're told in Psalms that God gives his beloved sleep. It's a gift. So how do we reconcile them? Rick?
Well, we have to have a certain amount of rest. I mean, even God talks about having rest for us. I mean, that's why he established that 1 day of rest. But we have to have a certain amount of rest, and there's a balance that we have to have. He's talking about in one verse, it's vain to get up early and then sit up too late, not getting enough rest, because then you're going to be worthless all day.
Right.
And then, let's see, what was the other one? Then anyway, you have to have the right amount. You have to have some rest to get through your day to operate properly. And so he's advising us to have that balance. But the other one is talking about laziness, as in I'm not even going to do my work, right?
Right.
So that's wrong. You can't do that. You're not supposed to work. You're supposed to rest when you're supposed to rest, and work when you're supposed to work, right?
Right.
And also you could say that part of that laziness is procrastination. Because it's like,
right.
Like you were saying, I'll do that later.
Right. Other thoughts? I think Rick nailed it on the head there with that one. It's when God rested, it was because he labored for 6 days first, right? Rest comes after work is done, right? And so even we labor here on earth. We spread the gospel. We live lives that are in accordance with God's will, looking forward to an eternal rest, right? We don't try and get the rest prior to that, right? And so what Solomon is talking about is different. He's talking about someone who's procrastinating or avoiding doing the work in the first place, right? Or just abusing rest, right? We are given sleep as a gift. Rest is a command, but like many things, it's a gift that can be abused, right? There's a good and healthy amount of rest and sleep, but then there is also an unhealthy way to do that. There's an unhealthy amount of rest and sleep. So we can take it too far. We can go to a point where we are avoiding hard work, where we are avoiding responsibilities. And Solomon explains where that lands us. That can put us in poverty, right? And I don't think it's too hard to see that connection that he's making there. So back over there in Proverbs chapter 6, as we wrap up this section, notice he says in verse 11 that when it comes upon you, it says it will come in like a drifter and your need like an armed man. Okay? So what is that telling us? Yes, we might end up in poverty, but he describes it further. Go ahead, Rick.
Now, mine says on poverty, it says like a proud.
Okay, like a proud. Yep.
That implies that it's stealing from you, right?
Mhm.
It's taking from you, so it's not a good thing for you. So that's your offer.
Yeah.
It's going to take your money away, your resources, and then your need, like an armed man. Well, that's like somebody who's taking you to jail or something like that. So there, your need is imprisoning you in a way.
Yeah.
In other words, you feel like you're getting ahead because, you're enjoying life. And
Yeah.
resting, you don't have to go to this work, but then suddenly you're going to pay the price.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's gonna come upon you against your will, is what he's saying, right? It's gonna be forced on you, like an armed man, right? You can imagine being held up or mugged. You don't have much power in that situation. You're forced to give up your money, right? And that's what he's saying. It's gonna come upon you in a way that you're gonna have no control over. Let's go ahead and read verses 12 to 19. Verses 12 to 19. Think about the third hunter that's mentioned here. A worthless person, a wicked man, is one who walks with a perverse mouth, who winks with his eyes, who signals with his feet, who points with his fingers, who, with perversion in his heart, continually devises evil, who spreads strife. Therefore, his disaster will come suddenly. Instantly he will be broken, and there will be no healing. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, and feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who declares lies, and one who spreads strife among his brothers. Okay, so this one is maybe a little bit less obvious than the laziness. What would you say is the hunter that can rob you of a good life in this one? Matt?
Unrighteousness in general.
Unrighteousness?
Maybe deceitfulness.
Deceitfulness?
That's how part of it sounds to me, because he's making decisions on signs stuff.
Okay. I think there are a lot of answers that you can get to that sound right to me. The way that I categorized this was I said evil speech, because he's saying things like plots and lies and gossip. This is someone who is getting trouble and causing trouble with their words, right? Now, again, I say evil speech because there are a lot of different ways you can abuse speaking. You can lie, you can gossip, you can use foul language, right? There's a lot of hurtful ways that you can do things with your speech, okay? So how does Solomon describe such a person who does these sorts of things? Verse 12. Vile and wicked, yeah. Vile, wicked, worthless, right? Someone of no account. The word there for worthless literally means of no value. Someone who does these things has no value. That's a strong statement for a human life, right? And again, notice how many forms that this sort of thing can take. So he says a perverse mouth, right? Now that's not necessarily foul language, because perverseness really just means things that are going against what God wills. Right? And so when you say something perverse, we tend to think of sexual immorality when we're talking about that. But it can be applied to other things. If you tell people you don't need baptism, right? If you say things like that, or, well, you don't have to attend church, you just have to believe God exists, right? That's contrary to what the Bible says. That would be something perverse, right? It's opposite of what God intends. And so perverse speech or a perverse mouth can take many different forms. Now you notice too, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, my mind goes to like gossip, scheming things and
Yeah.
just saying bad things about this person so that this other person,
Right.
is causing trouble.
Right. Gossiping, causing all kinds of strife and using lies to stir people up, right? Satan's described as the father of lies, right? So that should tell you how God feels about that sort of thing. Now, you also notice there's no loopholes with this, right? This isn't just spoken words. It's body language too, right? Signaling with eyes and hands and feet. You might say, well, I didn't lie to someone. I just wink, wink, or something like that. You can do things like that with body language, with nonverbal language, right? Pat? Right. Right. So it's not like it was like, oh, shoot, well, they got around it because he didn't actually say it out loud. He kind of pointed with his foot or whatever, right? This is all inclusive of that. The idea is that you are misleading people. You are giving them the wrong impression. You're being deceitful. Even if it's not a spoken lie, if you deceive someone by a gesture, by how you point or what you do, that's all included in it. We already talked about this, but lies and spreading strife, okay? So this can take many different forms. And notice where the actions culminate, where the actions culminate. So if you look at verse 14 and then verse 19, okay? Verse 14 and verse 19. It says in verse 14, who, with perversion in his heart, continually devises evil, who spreads strife. And then you drop down to verse 19, a false witness who declares lies and who spreads strife among the brothers. This evil speech, this, slander, gossip, lies, deceitfulness, all of this bad speech ultimately causes strife. That is the end result of so much of this. It causes strife. Okay. Now, I'm sure that, we understand what strife is, and it's not fun to be in the middle of it. It's not fun to endure strife. But you notice how strongly this is described in the way that God views it. Look at verse 16. In verse 16, Solomon is giving you a list, and he says, here are 6 things that the Lord hates. And then he says 7 are an abomination to him. So the way that they do this is just a way to poetically write this list in those days. He's saying these are very bad things, right? These are things that God hates that are abominations to him, okay? And you notice in this list, a lying tongue, a heart that devises wicked plans, a false witness who declares lies, one who spreads strife among his brothers. These are things that are abominations to God, right? Abominations. So this is very serious. Solomon is trying to emphasize how serious these things are and what the consequences are to this. Because again, it's easy for us to be misled about the severity of some sins. Certainly, it's easy to see how something like murder is bad, right? We understand that. There are societies that don't follow God that understand that murder is a serious issue, right? But lying is something that can happen easily. Or maybe you think, well, it wasn't a big deal because it was a small lie. Or, yeah, I kind of gossiped a little bit, but, that was a small thing, right? I was just telling someone about something. When we speak and we cause strife, that's an abomination to God. It's just as serious as some of these other things. And so, in taking Solomon's wisdom to heart, the same wisdom he's giving to his son, we need to watch what we say so that we don't end up causing strife with people, so that our behavior is not viewed as an abomination before God. Any thoughts, questions, or comments on that part? Okay. Let's go ahead and read about the last hunter here. This one's a slightly longer reading, so bear with me, but we're going to read down from verse 20 down to verse 35. He says, "My son, comply with the commandment of your father and do not ignore the teaching of your mother. Bind them continually on your heart. Tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk to you. For the commandment is a lamp and the teaching is light. And rebukes for discipline are the way of life, to keep you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the foreign woman. Do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her capture you with her eyelids. For the price of a prostitute reduces one to a loaf of bread, and an adulteress hunts for a precious life. Can anyone take fire in his lap and his clothes not be burned? Or can a person walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So is the one who goes in to his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her will not go unpunished. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is hungry. But when he is found, he must repay 7 times as much. He must give up all the property of his house. One who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself commits it. He will find wounds and disgrace, and his shame will not be removed. For jealousy enrages a man, and he will not have compassion on the day of vengeance. He will not accept any settlement, nor will he be satisfied, though you make it a large gift." Okay. So again, a little bit of a longer reading, but thinking about how we've looked at the rest of this chapter, what would you say is the fourth hunter that can rob you of good life? Yeah, I think so. I think that I would call this lust. Now, what we see as we read through this section is we see this character that Solomon has used more than once, the adulteress, right? He just had a speech about this woman in the previous one when he was warning his sons about adultery. And in a few earlier speeches, he sort of alluded to this and talked about it in passing, okay? And before he really dives into it, he almost pauses again to once again stress to his sons that he wants them to listen. And he gives his plea to wear wisdom, right? We've talked about this idea of keeping wisdom close as if it was a garment or a piece of jewelry. This idea of wearing it and remembering it. Some people might consider commandments stifling, right? It's the Bible is a set of rules, and these rules prevent me from living a life I want to, or these rules limit how I can live a life, or they limit my options, they limit my choices, they put burdens on me. I have to live this way, or I have to do this, right? That's the way that some can view it. However, Solomon has a different take on that. Solomon, he says that in verse 23, he says, for the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light, and rebukes for discipline are the way of life. So he looks at it a different way. He's looking at commandments or rules, teaching what the Bible is telling us how to live. He looks at that as enlightening. To him, it's not a burden, but rather it's wisdom. It's understanding of how I can live better and how things can be better for me. And he doesn't ignore the fact that God rebukes, right? God himself is very upfront about that. God says that he has compassion and mercy, but he also talks about his justice when he describes his character. And so God does rebuke. But Solomon here describes this as rebukes for discipline. When God is trying to discipline you, it is for life. In other words, this is for your benefit. And we see that in other places. We see how it's described as this is correction out of fatherly love, so that you won't end up in these poor situations, so that you won't end up in poverty, right? Discipline is exactly what Solomon is doing here. He's explaining to his sons wisdom so that they can live. Pat? He did. That's right. So he's giving this wisdom, he's giving this advice before he dives into lust. And this speech sort of functions as a bridge between the one that just came before and the one that just came after. Because Solomon has two speeches that are both about adultery. And this kind of bridges those two. But we're out of time for tonight, so we'll have to dive into the lust section of Proverbs chapter 6 next week. So thank you, everyone.